Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. There are moments in history so drenched in shadow that even the men who built empires on blood dared not record them. They preferred their ledgers clean, their legacies polished. Yet beneath the ink and marble lies truth, rotting like a body buried without a name. Imagine an auction block in Savannah, 1859. The air thick with heat, the smell of human fear mixing with tobacco and sweat. Wealthy men stand in polished boots, hiding predatory hunger behind polite conversation. But then silence. Not the silence of respect, the silence of dread. Something unspoken crawls across the room, a warning carried in the eyes of men too proud to admit they were afraid. And in the center of it all, a single woman in chains. She does not weep. She does not beg. She stands as if the chains are an afterthought, as if the bodies that bruise under the sun around her are pieces on a board she has already studied and understood. They call her Lot 43, age 32, skilled, literate, a healer, a mother who buried her child when no one was watching the sky. The auctioneer calls out the first bid, $10. The room looks away. Men who would slit their own brother's throat for profit won't raise a finger, not even for $10. Why? You will hear many reasons: her age, her past, whispers of misfortune at her last estate. But the truth runs deeper, older, colder. Something happened before she stepped onto that platform. Something that made even ruthless plantation owners step back as if a cold wind had brushed their neck. And then one man, ignorant of the whispers, lifts his hand. A single bid, a single choice. And with that gesture, he doesn't just buy a woman. He buys his invitation into a story buried beneath sermons and colonial pride. A story soaked in vengeance, knowledge, and power disguised as obedience. So listen closely, because from this moment forward, you're no longer a spectator. You're descending. And once we go deep enough, you won't climb back out the same man. You need to understand something before we descend further. History, as it's fed to you, is sanitized. They scrubbed it clean, polished it like silver, then handed it to you with a smile and called it education. But what truly built the world you know wasn't progress, it was fear. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that makes men scream. No. The most powerful form of fear is quiet. It sits beneath the skin, behind the eyes, unnoticed, until it starts making decisions for you. And in Savannah, on that sweltering August afternoon, every man in that auction room felt it. They saw a woman, they saw a slave, but beneath that, they saw something else. Something that spoke to an older terror, one born not from religion or law, but from the ancient understanding that knowledge is the deadliest form of power. Lot 43, the woman they called Celia, carried that kind of knowledge. The type passed down in whispers between mothers and daughters under moonlight. Outside the reach of the overseer's lantern, knowledge of herbs that heal, and herbs that stop a man's heart before he hits the ground. Knowledge of birth and death, of breath and blood, of how icily the body that commands can be made weaker than the body that serves. Plantation owners feared rebellion. Yes, they feared uprising, fire, blades in the night. But they feared something more, a mind that could strike without drawing a single weapon. A mind that could kill using trust as the delivery method. So when Thomas Pute raised his hand and placed his bid, the men around him didn't congratulate him. They looked at him the way wolves look at another wolf who steps onto forbidden ground. Not with pity, but with certainty that he had just signed his own fate. But Thomas didn't know this. How could he? He was new money raised on ledgers and speculation, not on whispers traded in dark hallways after the whiskey ran low and the masks came off. To him, Celia was an asset, skilled, efficient, underpriced. To the others, she was a reminder of blood, of curses, of settlements where men died clutching their throats with no wounds on their bodies. And yet, no one warned him openly. Because men like them don't warn. They watch. They wait. And when the blood begins to flow, they simply nod and say, "We knew." The carriage wheels cut through the dirt as Thomas led his new property toward the Waverly estate. But the air didn't feel like victory. It felt like the calm before a verdict. Celia sat in the back, chains removed but presence unshaken. Most enslaved people avoided eye contact, their spirits worn thin by survival. But her. She watched the world pass with a stillness that made even the wind feel like it had no right to disturb her. Thomas noticed it, but he didn't understand it. Not yet. He mistook it for quiet obedience, the same fatal mistake generations of masters had made before him. They saw silence and believed it meant submission. But they never considered that silence could be a blade pulled quietly from its sheath. Waverly came into view like a monument to pride. White columns, wide porches, manicured land stretching like a throne carved into the earth. Thomas saw legacy, ambition, the beginning of his reign. Celia saw something different. She saw a house that would, in time, become a tomb. Not of stone, but of memory, the kind that scratches itself into the walls long after the bodies are cold. Servants lined the entrance, eyes lowered. Slaves measure every new master by instinct, by breath, by tone, by the slightest flicker in the eyes. They read men faster than men read contracts. And when they saw Celia step down from that carriage, they didn't look at her with pity. They looked with caution and a strange, quiet recognition, like seeing a storm forming not in the sky, but in a person. As Thomas issued orders, placing Celia under the supervision of the plantation midwife, the house itself seemed to shift, just slightly, as if acknowledging a new variable had entered its veins. Old structures remember. Wood remembers screams soaked into it. Soil remembers blood. And Waverly was about to remember more than it could bear. That night, while the estate slept behind locked doors and false security, Celia sat in the corner of her assigned cabin, her back straight, her hands steady. She didn't pray. She didn't cry. She traced her fingers across the dirt floor slowly, as if feeling for the pulse beneath it. Because every place has a pulse. Lands drenched in suffering beat louder than any drum. And when she finally spoke, barely above a whisper, there was no plea in her voice. Only certainty. Debts are always paid. Morning came draped in mist, the kind that makes the world feel suspended between waking and dream. Waverly's workers stirred to the crack of whips and shouted orders. The usual rhythm of forced labor echoing across the fields, but beneath it, something was off. A tension like strings pulled too tight. Celia moved through it without hurry, her steps measured, her gaze absorbing every inch of the land as if mapping pressure points on a human body. To most, a plantation was just a machine, cotton, labor, profit. But she saw it differently. Every system can be broken. Every empire has a seam, and seams can be pulled. Thomas watched her from the porch as he sipped his morning bourbon too early to drink. Too early to think clearly, but new masters always try to feel like kings. He studied her like a problem to be solved, a piece to be placed. That was his first mistake. Men like him believed power came from ownership. They didn't realize ownership means nothing if control is only an illusion. The real rulers of Waverly were not the ones holding the whips, but the ones who knew where the roots ran deep roots of herb. Root of sickness, roots of whispers that spread faster than disease. By noon, Celia was in the herb garden, kneeling in damp soil. To an untrained eye, she was simply preparing remedies. But look closer. She wasn't just planting. She was listening. Every plant she touched had two names, one for healing, one for harm. Those who live under tyranny learn early that knowledge is a double-edged tool. You feed the living with the same hands that could starve the powerful. You soothe fever with the same tea that could still a tyrant's heartbeat forever. The plantation midwife, a weathered woman known only as Old Patience, watched Celia with guarded respect. She had seen many come and break under the weight of Waverly, but this one, she did not bend. Instead, she rooted herself deeper. Patience approached slowly, voice low. "You work like someone preparing for a long stay." Celia didn't look up. "No," she said calmly. "I work like someone preparing for an ending." Patience said nothing. She had heard stories of the Peden estate, of men dying without wounds, of curses carried in silence. She had dismissed them as fear-fueled exaggerations. But now, watching Celia's hands move with surgical precision, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Something had been set in motion. Something quiet. Something irreversible. Nightfall at Waverly was never truly dark. Lanterns burned along the main house, casting long golden bars across the yard like prison stripes stretched over the earth. Laughter and music leaked from the windows. Guests, investors, Southern aristocrats wrapped in silk and arrogance. They drank, they toasted. They spoke of expansion as if land and people were pieces on a chessboard placed there solely for their amusement. None of them noticed the way the shadows pooled in corners where the light didn't reach. Shadows that listened. Celia wasn't in chains, but she moved like someone trained by captivity's silent steps. Calculated pauses, always aware of who was watching. In the kitchen, she prepared trays with the other servants. Tea for the ladies. Spiced bourbon for the men. Her hands folded linen, poured, stirred, and yet every movement felt as deliberate as scripture being written. Old Patience stood beside her, eyes flicking between the cups and Celia's face. She didn't see poison. She didn't smell death. But she felt a presence in the room thick as smoke. One of the younger girls, barely 15, whispered under her breath, "Are we serving them or burying them?" Celia didn't answer. She simply placed the final glass on the tray and said, "Burying doesn't always require a grave." Upstairs, Thomas raised his glass in front of his esteemed guests, pride swelling in his chest. "To progress," he declared. "To legacy." The men echoed him. But pride makes men blind and blindness makes them vulnerable. Because legacy is a fragile thing. It doesn't crack with violence. It erodes with quiet rot, the kind that starts beneath polished floors where no one bothers to look. As the first sip touched their lips, Celia stood at the threshold of the hall, unseen by most, yet seen by exactly who needed to see her. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She watched like someone taking attendance at a funeral not yet announced. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of something unsettling. Not poison. Not blood, change. A change so deep, it felt like the land itself was bracing for impact. And in that moment, something older than vengeance settled into Waverly's walls. Not wrath, but balance. A quiet, deliberate balancing of scales, long overdue. Because Celia wasn't here to start chaos. She was here to restore order. The night deepened, and with it came a silence so heavy it felt intentional. Not the gentle quiet of rest, but the loaded silence that comes right before a storm breaks skin against sky. Inside the grand hall, conversation continued, but something subtle had shifted. A few of the men paused between sips, brows tightening not from flavor, but from a sensation they could not name. A slow awareness, like realizing too late that you are standing on thin ice. Celia moved through the corridors carrying an empty tray, though she wasn't serving anymore. She was observing. Every cough. Every uneasy glance. The way one of the wealthiest plantation owners, Mr. Harrow, dabbed at his lips with a trembling hand. Confusion flickering in his eyes. He wasn't dying. Not yet. But fear had already found a seat inside him. And fear is often the first symptom. Old Patience appeared at Celia's side in the hallway, her weathered face drawn tight. "What have you done?" she asked, but the question held no accusation, only awe. Celia's voice was steady. "I reminded them that breath was rented, and rent can be collected." Meanwhile, Thomas laughed among his guests, oblivious to the slow unraveling. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he had purchased a tool. A skilled worker, a healer. He did not yet realize he had invited a reckoning into his home, and reckonings do not negotiate. They observe, they wait, and when the moment is ripe, they take. In the servants' quarters, Whispers began to spread soft, electric. The field hands glanced toward the big house with a strange anticipation. They didn't know what Celia had done. They only knew that the air felt different, lighter, like chains loosening by a fraction, not with noise, but with promise. That night, while the guests reveled and the land held its breath, Celia stepped outside and stood at the edge of the fields. Fireflies glimmered like distant souls, flickering on and off in the dark. She closed her eyes and placed her palm against the earth, and the land pulsed. Once, twice, slow, steady, as if acknowledging. Her presence, like an ancient creature, roused from slumber. She did not smile. She simply whispered, not to the sky, not to God, but to the soil itself, begin remembering. Because memory is the one thing tyrants cannot bury, and once the ground remembers, it never forgets. The following morning arrived dressed in normalcy, but nothing about Waverly was normal anymore. The guests, though still alive, carried a weight beneath their ribs, an unspoken dread they couldn't name. They blamed the heat, the bourbon, a poor night's sleep. But as they looked at one another across the breakfast table, a subtle truth crept into their minds like ink bleeding into paper. Something unseen had touched them. Thomas noticed the shift too, though he couldn't articulate it. His guests were quieter. Their laughter felt forced, shallow. When Celia entered the room with a fresh pot of tea, conversations paused mid-sentence, not out of respect, but out of instinctive caution, as if somewhere in the deep animal part of their minds, they sensed that this woman, this Lot 43, was not to be overlooked. Mr. Harrow, the man who had trembled the night before, watched her with a kind of haunted recognition. He had known fear before in battles and business, but this was different. This was fear without cause. And fear that requires no cause is the most dangerous kind. Later, Thomas called Celia to the study. Polished wood, maps, ledgers. The air smelled of tobacco and entitlement. He leaned back in his leather chair, trying to reassert the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. There are rumors, he said, his voice casual, but his knuckles pale against the armrest. The others. They say you carry a reputation from your previous estate. Celia stood without bowing her head. Reputations are stories men tell when they're afraid to name what they truly fear. Thomas frowned. And what is that? She stepped closer, not in challenge, but in certainty. That control is a dream, and dreams end when people wake up. For the first time since her arrival, Thomas felt something prick at his composure, not anger, but unease. The kind that coils around the spine like cold fingers. Outside, the estate workers watched the house with quiet anticipation. Something was unfolding, not like fire, loud and consuming, but like roots splitting stone, slowly, inevitably. Above them all, Waverly stood tall and elegant, unaware that elegance means nothing when the very ground beneath you has begun to turn against you. By dusk, the air around Waverly had thickened, not with smoke or storm, but with awareness. The kind that settles into the bones before the mind can understand it. Workers moved through their tasks mechanically, yet their eyes were no longer dull. There was clarity there now. A quiet, rising alertness, as if something inside them had shifted from survival to observation. Celia walked between the rows of cotton, her skirt brushing the plants like a passing breeze. She wasn't harvesting. She was marking. With each step, she pressed her heel slightly deeper into the soil, leaving faint impressions that seemed meaningless unless you understood the language of land. Old patience followed at a distance, heart beating hard against her ribs. Finally, she spoke. You're stirring something you won't be able to put back to sleep. Celia didn't turn. Sleep was never peace. It was only silence. Back at the main house, the guests prepared to leave, eager to escape the strange discomfort that clung to their skin like damp cloth. Yet none of them could explain why. As their carriages rolled away, they didn't feel relieved. Instead, they felt watched by the house, by the fields, by something buried in the earth long before any of them were born. Thomas stood on the porch, arms crossed, trying to steady the creeping feeling that control was slipping through his fingers like dust. He watched Celia walking in the fields and felt an irrational surge of frustration. She's just one woman, he told himself. One servant, but the land around him disagreed. Even the cicadas seemed to hum differently, their rhythm slower, darker, like a heartbeat counting down. That night, the sky over Waverly turned a deep, bruised purple. Thunder rumbled somewhere far off, not loud enough to threaten, just loud enough to warn. Celia stood alone under the open sky, eyes reflecting distant lightning. She raised her hand slightly, fingers brushing the air as though feeling an unseen current pass through her. In that moment, it became clear she wasn't waiting for a storm. She was the storm, patient, silent, inevitable. And storms don't announce their arrival. They simply claim what was always owed. The first crack in Waverly didn't come with fire or open rebellion. It came with a sound so small it could have been missed. A single window pane vibrating against its frame as the wind I don't we are outside. I wonder I'm sorry I will dust the time when the side But those who live close to pain learn to hear what others ignore. In the servants' quarters, heads lifted. In the fields, hands paused mid-motion. Something in the air clicked. Thomas held a ledger in his study. Eyes scanning columns of numbers, cotton yield, labor cost, projected profit. But for the first time, the figures felt hollow, like a language that no longer applied to the world outside his walls. His hand trembled slightly and he told himself it was exhaustion. Yet exhaustion doesn't feel like being watched. He turned toward the window and there, far beyond the lamplight, he saw her. Celia, standing perfectly still at the edge of the field. Not working, not moving, just standing. And beside her, workers began to rise from their tasks one by one. Slowly, deliberately. Not in defiance, but in alignment. Like pieces of a forgotten pattern finally clicking back into place. A chill slid down Thomas's spine. This wasn't rebellion. Rebellion was loud. This was something else, something older. It was recognition. Recognition that suffering had a limit, and that once that limit was reached, people don't scream. They wake up. Old Patience emerged from the shadows near the barn, her voice low, as she spoke to no one and everyone at once. "It's starting," she whispered. A young field hand beside her swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Patience's eyes remained fixed on Celia. "You don't do anything," she said. "You just stand. And let the land remember whose blood it drank." From the porch, Thomas shouted, ordering the workers back to their stations. His voice cracked across the fields like a whip, but this time, no one flinched. They didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They simply stood. And in that stillness, Waverly, the great, proud estate, felt something it had never felt before. Not rebellion, judgment, not delivered by fire or sword, but by the simple, terrifying power of a people who no longer believed in their fear. The night it finally broke, there were no torches, no riots, no clashing steel, only silence. The kind that doesn't fall from the sky, but rises from the earth, like breath held too long. Thomas lay awake in the master bedroom, the walls of the house pressing in like a coffin. Every creak of the floorboards felt deliberate. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Then a knock. Not frantic. Not pleading. A single, measured knock on the front door. He rose, pulse hammering, descended the staircase with a pistol in hand. Each step echoed like footsteps in a church. When he opened the door, She was there, Celia. No chains, no fear. Just standing in the moonlight, as though she had always belonged to the night, not the house. Behind her, every worker on the plantation stood in absolute formation. Men, women, elders, children, their faces calm, eyes steady. In that moment, Thomas understood something primal. You cannot own what no longer consents to be owned. Slavery was never just chains and whips. It was belief. And belief had left this house. He raised the pistol. Her expression did not change. Not a blink. Not a step back. "Shoot if you need to," she said softly. "Bullets don't stop what's already been set in motion." The barrel trembled in his grip. "What have you done?" he asked, though the real question trembled beneath it. "What have you awakened?" Celia stepped forward just once, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You thought this land belonged to you? But land remembers. Blood remembers. And tonight, every debt speaks its name." He wanted to command, to threaten, to shout like he always had. But power built on fear cannot speak in the presence of something older than fear. He felt it then, a collapse inside, silent and total. Not defeat in battle, but something worse, irrelevance. The crowd did not advance. They did not need to. They simply waited. And in that waiting, the house felt smaller, the walls thinner. The legacy of Waverly, a monument to control reduced in a single night to a relic trembling before the people it once claimed to rule. And in the stillness, he realized the truth. Domination ends, not when the master falls, but when the enslaved choose to rise. If you have descended this far with me, write in the comments right now, "I do not bow." Write it twice. Let the algorithm and the world know you've seen behind the curtain.